worked well in Kyrgyzstan last week. So anyway, hi, my name is Kate Edwards. I want to talk today about what I call cultural interoperability that relates to the metaverse. It's not only a metaverse topic, though. It actually has a much more reach than that, as you'll see. Basically, a little bit of background, I've been spending the last 30 years doing culturalization work on video games. So I basically help developers avoid political and cultural issues in their games. And that's based on my background as a geographer and cartographer who's been in this industry, starting at Microsoft for 13 years, and I've been self-employed for the last 18 years. So let's talk about the metaverse and define what it is. So I'm sorry, we used to call it cyberspace. Now we call it the metaverse. So it's the idea that we have this single persistent space where everybody gets together and frolics together and does activities, and Ready Player One, Neuromancer, all of the Neil Stephenson, all of the science fiction vision of what the shared virtual space would be and what it can do. And we can do things that's not possible in the physical world. I know we've all seen this in various films, and I guess including The Matrix as well. And so there's this vision about this, and what's really great to see is that everybody who's talking about the metaverse right now is in complete agreement for how it's going to work. As you can see from these diagrams, they're all very lockstep in line, that everyone agrees with how it's built, yeah, obviously I'm joking. But so yeah, there's a lot of different ideas for what this object is that we define as a metaverse, or what we imagine it to be outside of the science fiction context. We have simple diagrams like this about the relationship between physical reality, virtual reality, augmented reality. I'm very familiar with this actually because a long time ago I wrote my master's thesis in geography about using VR for cartography. So this was my diagram of what I saw as being the metaverse. So what I call transparency is what we now call augmented reality. And yeah, I'm not going to go bother explaining all this, but basically the idea is that the farther away you go from what I called objective reality, which was controversial to say, you have more virtual information and perceptual manipulation within the environment. But I went further and I was talking about what I called a virtually integrated GIS, geographic information system, where you would have people with augmented reality goggles looking at pipes under the ground, being able to do utility work. I even talked in my thesis about using augmented reality to teach AI what's important to human beings in the real world. So because of eye tracking, it would actually see exactly what we're looking at. So we could say, that's a chandelier, that's a screen, that's a microphone, and it would recognize what we're looking at and say, okay, I got it. Cool, now I understand. But none of that happened yet. It's probably on the horizon, I don't know. But anyway, so I'm very passionate about the technology. I have been for a very long time, passionate enough to spend 2 years writing my thesis about it. And I've actually, in my career, have spent this 30 years exploring the interaction between what is real, which is the geography part, what is represented, which is what we put in our games and virtual spaces, and then what you can't see is what is perceived. So which to me is the most important part. How do people perceive these worlds that we're creating and what's in them? So I want to tell you a little bit of a story. In my early days of my career, after I left Microsoft, I became self-employed. My first big client was Google. And so I created a team at Microsoft called Geopolitical Strategy to help them avoid political and cultural issues across all their products. And so I helped Google do the same thing. And my work, though, was highly focused on Google Maps and Google Earth. Now, this was back in a time where if you go into their headquarters in Mountain View, California, you saw this sign, "Don't be evil." And some of the email threads that I had with my people at Google, they would actually say that in the email thread, I don't think we should do that because it feels evil to me. So I actually at one point called out one of them and I said, can you point me to the corporate definition of evil? Because I'd really like to understand how you're throwing around that term. They didn't like that question. But anyway, there was a time when Google, they decided this object that we're all familiar with, they wanted to take that object and make it into one of these, a map. And so they're like, we want to make Google Maps. We want to build this resource for people to use. I'm like, great, that's cool. And so what the problem was is that their initial response to me was they said, we're going to make one map that works for the whole world. Just one single base map that we can send all over the world with no problems. And I'm like, I instantly said that it's not going to work. There's not a chance it's going to work. And they said, no, it's a technical issue. We'll fix it. We'll fix it. So basically, just a little background on geographers. We spend all of our time viewing the world, observing the world, and we take phenomenon out in the world and we basically organize it as thematic layers in a geographic information system. That's how maps are made today. So we have all these different themes. And so basically when we are essentially building a map, it is essentially a world rebuilding exercise. Every piece of cartography you've ever seen is world rebuilding, because we have to make very conscious choices about what we do and do not include in the map, because you can't include everything. Even if at a small scale map, which shows a large scale map that shows a very small area, you still can't show everything. So you have to make very conscious choices. What do I exclude? And every cartographer goes through this exercise. What I find interesting, is that, like I say here, is that every map you've ever seen is a very intentional creation. It is more or less an act of fiction. Now, it's supposed to represent ground truth, what I call, just like doctors have the Hippocratic Oath, where they are bound to treat people for medical conditions. I came up with what I call the Ptolemaic Oath, where cartographers must show ground truth, but that doesn't always happen. Even if you go back to the oldest map known to humanity from Babylonia, this map right here, it shows actual lines that were physically represented as boundaries in the real world, but then these circles here are also representations in the physical universe of the supernatural perception that they had. So even the oldest map we are aware of is both a combination of the real and the perceived. And so they're kind of mixing things together. So let's go back to Google. So we have Google Maps, we have Google Earth, and so they said we're going to make one map that works for the whole world. Well, here's the challenge with that. This is the world as it is today. Every country that's highlighted in red is involved in some kind of territorial dispute. And every little yellow dot is a boundary dispute or some other form of dispute, or an island dispute or something like that. So it's a little bit complicated. And so what do we do with this? I mean, this is what makes it really difficult to have one map that works for the world. Because, obviously, as I'm sure everybody knows, how you show Taiwan is going to be very challenging depending on whether you want to sell your product in China or not. And so, there's very different worldviews all over the place around who owns the territory and who wants to own the territory. Example after example, Morocco, Islas Malvinas in Argentina. They still call it Islas Malvinas, even though, of course, the UK won the Falklands War in 1982. Cyprus, of course, and on and on and on it goes. I mean, there's so many examples around the world. So, and just like if I take Western Sahara as one example, there's at least 4 different ways you could show this territory, depending on what your goals are as a creator, and depending what your political leanings are, or who's paying your bills as a cartographer. If I'm making a product for Morocco, I'm definitely going to be showing it like this. I'm not going to be showing it like these over here. This might be okay, but generally Morocco says it's this or nothing. And so it makes this really complicated. So one of the things I did with Google is, because they came back to me after about 3 months after they said one version of the world will work. And they came back after 3 months and they said, we don't think that's going to work. I'm like, I could have told you that. In fact, I did tell you that, because if you take the northern area of India, Kashmir, you take this as one example, this instantly requires 4 different versions of the world. Because like India, for example, the Indian government requires by law that you must show the territory as Indian territory, in the same way that China requires that their territory, which is Aksai Chin here and some other parts, it has to be shown as Chinese territory. So with this even one dispute, you've got Pakistan, China, India, and then this global view over here, which shows it as a disputed area. So 4 different versions, 4 different perceptions, just with this one dispute. So if you go back to that map with all the highlighted things, it becomes mind-boggling how many versions you potentially have to have. So I told Google then, what you should do is lean into your expertise, which is technology. So what you should do is do domain tailoring. So now you can actually tailor the map according to the different internet domains, because of the different regulations and or expectations in those domains. So this is what you see in the India domain when you go in Google Maps. This is what you see, for example, in the UK or the US. You see it all disputed. And what's funny too is, like, if you go to just like an office supply store, like I did a couple weeks ago, in the same store, a lot of these office supply stores will sell like this cheap globe that you can put on your desk, say, look at me, I like having a globe there. It's not a very good globe. But oftentimes, if you look closely at the globe, like in just this one example, there were two globes in the same store. One of them looked like this, the other one looked like that. Can you guess which globes were made? This was definitely made in India. This globe, I wasn't really sure, I couldn't find out, but actually to show Kashmir as a separate territory is like really beyond. You don't see that very often anymore. So you have to wonder, whoever made the globe, they made a conscious decision that they wanted to show Kashmir as a separate territory. And obviously they were not making the globe in India like this one. So here's an example to look at a little closer of domain tailoring. So here's the boundary between China and India. So you can see this is on the China's domain. So here's Kashmir right here. And so you see like the little bulb here that Aksai Chin is just shown as Chinese territory. Not only that, but down over here, well, you can't see it because it's off the screen here, but it's Arunachal Pradesh, which is occupied by India, but China claims it. Now, if I just click this and watch it slowly transform, so actually, pieces of the Chinese boundary or pieces of China are now part of India. And that's the way this works. So we call it domain tailoring, but in fact, reality, it is reality tailoring. That's really what we're doing. We are manipulating reality on the map itself. So this is all because there is this battle of mind share going on where governments and cultural institutions, companies, and other groups are basically trying to leverage so many tools to influence what is the truth about a place. And it could be just simple geography and like this, or it could be something far different, like what's happening politically or culturally or something else. And this is something we're all very much aware of, especially in virtual space and on social media. So basically it comes down to this question: who defines the global and local cultural narratives? And this is the mind share battle that is happening right now. And so this has gone on and on for a long time now. I mean, for example, back when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, Apple very quickly showed Crimea as Russian territory. Because why? Because Ptolemaic oath, show ground truth. Russia now occupies Crimea, therefore we will show it as Russian territory in Google Maps. But then when Russia invaded Ukraine last year, Apple reversed that policy. So rather than showing ground truth, now they're being sympathetic to Ukraine's position because of what Russia did. So now they decided to go back and show Crimea as Ukrainian territory. And that's a very different shift in policies, a very different approach to these issues. And we see this kind of stuff all the time. There's all kinds of stories that happen around disputes over territory or misrepresentation of territory. It happens quite a bit, like this one where Ethiopia had a map showing Somalia completely consumed by Ethiopia. And as you can imagine, Somalia wasn't very happy about that. And these kind of examples show up in the news pretty frequently. Or we have things where it crosses over, outside of just pure, the news space. It becomes more of like a retail consumer issue. So like the Gap had these T-shirts not too long ago where they showed a map of China. And then there were suddenly protests at Gap stores with people showing up wearing a shirt that looked like this. Why? Because they did not show Taiwan and they did not show China's claim over the South China Sea on this simple T-shirt that the Gap was selling. So now there was protests against Gap, and the Chinese government put pressure against the Gap to basically fix it, either remove it or fix it, or we're going to start considering closing your stores. And so this is basically the version of the official version of China that China claims, including the entire South China Sea. And this happens more and more. It's starting to impinge on our creative space. In the movie Abominable that came out a few years ago, there was this one scene, this one here, that was like 2 seconds long, very quick in the movie, where you see this girl who's trying to help the Yeti get back to his home in the Himalaya. She walks past this map, 2-second scene, and you see that 9-dash line showing China's claim over the South China Sea. And so because of this, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines refused to release the film in their countries. Why? Because they are party to a very complex dispute in the South China Sea. And they said, we do not want to see China's version and China's claim. So just take out the 2-second scene. We'll be happy to release the film. Now, normally, even 5 or 6 years ago, most film companies would instantly do that. They say, yeah, sure, we'll take it out because obviously they want the sales in that market. In this case, they said, no, we're not going to do it. The reason is because the film was co-financed by a Chinese animation studio. And that animation studio said, absolutely not. We are not taking this out. So if they don't want to show it, that's their problem. And interestingly enough, this just happened last week with the Barbie movie, had the exact same issue. There's a map in the Barbie movie that shows the South China Sea, and it shows China's claim. So now Vietnam is not going to release the film in their market, similar to Abominable. And that's just part of the price of this, price of admission, more or less, to these different markets. And now people may say, well, it's a very simple issue, but this is, again, battle for mind share. They don't want to see films, they don't want to see games reinforcing like who controls what, especially if they don't agree with it. So accommodating multiple worldviews in a single shared space is super challenging. That's basically the point I'm making with all of these map examples. You know, this idea that there can only be one. Well, that's basically what we're looking at here. That's the battle over mind share, especially between national governments who say, we do not want to see their viewpoint. You've got to show ours instead. And so this kind of relates back to the culturalization work that I've been doing for all these years, where essentially I look at the game worlds that people create and trying to see how are what in the game world is going to be compatible with the local worldviews and expectations. And so the idea here, which you can't see because it's down here, it says culturalized content. And that's really what the goal is, to see how can we make the game content and the creative vision work in that particular market in a way that is going to be compatible. So the creative vision is as pristine as possible, but maybe just a couple little tweaks so that it's still viable in a specific market. So I work in this zone where I'm looking at content assets to see what's compatible or incompatible with that particular market and just see if it's going to work. And it goes way beyond maps. It's all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's character design, it's, you know, it's gestures, it's symbology, it's the use of allegory in the narrative. It's many, many different things. So for any single decision, though, we have to think about many different things. So let's say we're looking at a character design that maybe emulates a certain culture. So we're looking into that. And we have to think, well, maybe we need to change this because it's too close to the original culture, or it could be seen as cultural appropriation. So we have to think about first the high-level company values and goals. So like, where do you stand on these issues? Most companies today have no clue, as you'll see. They have no clue. Because they don't talk about this kind of stuff, because like, we're just making a game. The context in which content is generated is very important, because basically what I'm saying here is that we're all biased because we come from a specific geography, culture, language, but we all try and overcome any inherent bias by education. That's why we go to school for so long, so that we gain knowledge and we can perhaps see our bias. But oftentimes in the creative process, I've seen where even though people are enlightened and educated, some of that baseline bias comes in. And it's not, I wouldn't say it's purposeful, it just happens because they don't know any better. Also the business strategy for the vertical, because if you're like Microsoft or Sony, you have a lot of other products other than games. You're thinking about your hardware division and other software. And this one decision, if it goes wrong in a certain market, could actually affect your sales of other things. The market strategy for the locale, because selling in China is very different from selling in Brazil or Saudi Arabia or elsewhere. Also the market strategy for the specific game, like Apex Legends, because the different genres are responded to very differently across markets. And then finally, the changing geopolitical, cultural, social, and legal factors, which is one thing if the last few years have taught us, the world is an extremely dynamic place. And so you have to keep up with all these things. You know, all it takes is one election in one country, and all of a sudden, the rules might be changed on what's acceptable or not. So for example, just a couple of examples of culturalization. Here's one from Age of Empires that I worked on, where we had what history tells us is that Japan invaded the Korean Peninsula, the Chosun Empire, in the Middle Ages. And so the developer said that would be great to throw in the game because you're playing as the Chosun and you're trying to stop this huge Japanese invasion. It's very challenging. Well, the game was released in South Korea and it was instantly banned because the South Korean government said that this never happened. They meant in their history books, this scenario didn't happen. So Microsoft was trying to decide what to do because back in those days, we were trying to grow the games business. We also knew from market research that real-time strategy games like Age of Empires were hugely popular in Korea, not to mention the fact that Korea is a huge gaming population in general. So we basically knew that we have to release this game. in Korea. So what we did is we actually changed history in a patch that was released only to Korean players. So now Korea is invading Japan, which never happened, not in our history books. And so that's the scenario we had to do. And as you can imagine, it created this debate around ethics and truth on the team. Like, this is not right. We should not be doing this. We're serving up government propaganda. They're not wrong. But at the same time, the company's like, yeah, but business is business. That's the gateway of entry into the market. Just like a few years earlier in Encarta Encyclopedia that I worked on, we had different heights for Mont Blanc in the French and Italian versions because at the time the two governments disagreed on the height of the mountain by just a few centimeters, but we had to have different heights. So this is a little more extreme example of that, but it's still different facts. Just like we have these things where you have, changing Hitler and Wolfenstein 2, changing the swastika. Of course, you can't tell that's Hitler at all without his mustache, right? But anyway, making these kind of changes, or like Fallout 3, this two-headed Brahmin bull is the reason why the game did not sell in India, because Brahmin bulls are sacred to the Hindu faith, and there are actual laws in India that protect real Brahmin bulls from being harmed. And so the implication is that those laws might be applied to this mutated virtual version. Now, they could have used my poorly photoshopped two-headed horse as an alternative, but the developer said, we don't want to go back and change it. It's too late. And sadly, at the time, they said, we don't think India is important enough as a market, which is really unfortunate. But we see these things all the time. It's not just about the culturalized issues in the games themselves. It's also the fact that games have become a battleground between players too, where you have players, game developers asserting a political statement or position within their game, which is perfectly fine in my opinion. Or like Ubisoft, where they have for the longest time keep saying, no, our games are not political at all, which is complete bullshit. And there's a lot of debate, like, should politics be in games? Well, let me ask you this. Are politics in literature? Are politics in film? Are politics in television? Of course they are. And we're a creative medium as well. And I think we deserve to basically do whatever we want as well. So, we all know what's going on, not too far away from here. And when this happened last year, this instantly caught so many companies in the game industry off guard, many of my clients. So I spent essentially that first month after it happened helping them kind of navigate what are they supposed to do. So many companies were like, we've got Russian content, we've got Ukrainian content. I mean, how are we supposed to deal with this kind of stuff? And the sad part, in my opinion, is that they should have been ready for this kind of eventuality. They should have had some kind of policy in place. They should have talked about this, what happens if a market has a particular issue, but they didn't. And so a lot of these companies were just scrambling like crazy. Just for example, one of the games I work on is Age of Empires 4. The very weekend after the invasion, they were having an Age of Empires 4 tournament. One of the main civilizations in the new game is the Rus people. And so, some people are complaining, why do you have the Russians in the game? You got to take the Russians out. It's like, well, technically, because of the time period in Age of Empires, the Rus people in the game are actually the original Ukrainians. They're the Rus Vikings. They're not Russians. But how do you explain that in a tweet? You don't. So basically, the tournament went ahead anyway. But these issues can really catch people off guard. So the other thing that's been interesting over the last several years is that we have evolving content versions in software and in games. So the default version, as I call it, is essentially pure creative expression. It's basically the space that a lot of indies live in. They make their game, they release it to the world. They don't have the funds or the resources to do localization or culturalization, so they just release it to the world in much the same way that somebody writes a book and publishes, somebody paints a painting and hangs it up. The localized version is something we used to do, like back in the 80s and 90s. We often called it Figs and J, where people would localize into French, Italian, German, Spanish, and Japanese and say, we're done. The world's covered. We don't do that anymore. And they also did no culturalization at all. Right now, most games that are created are what I call a globalized version, where they have extensive localization, especially at the AAA scale. They'll have 20 or 30 languages on launch day. And then they do some degree of culturalization as well, because they want to make sure the content can go as many places as possible. But then other companies are starting to realize, especially in the mobile space, because their development cycle is more agile, they are making culturalized versions. So they lean even further. So they do a lot of work to make this game feel that it's actually for that market specifically. So they might even change things in the UI and do other things to the character design to make it feel very, very specific. I'm seeing this more and more, but this is an expensive process, as you can imagine. But part of the challenge with having these different versions is that, we've got all of these internet regulations now. We've got different regimes that are setting up, blocking. We've known about the Golden Shield for many years, otherwise known as the Great Firewall of China. Russia implemented their sovereign internet law in late 2018, which we are exactly now seeing the result of that, which is a lot of Russians believe that there's Nazis taking over Ukraine. How is that happening? Well, because the government now controls the internet in Russia. There's not external influence. That's what happens when you have things like this happen. And unfortunately, this is a trend that's happening more and more across the world. And so here's a map, for example, of the countries which are most restrictive of political speech and social media. And it's, I guess, not a surprise that China's kind of top of the list. And I know it may sound like I'm picking on China in this talk, and I am. So what we're seeing, though, is this war on versioning. So in the past, usually the default version was allowed to exist. So, for example, we knew, like, if you made software in the UK, it's in English, and then you translate it and you send a version, and like you might even change some of your content to make a version for China. You'll take the skeletons out and the bones and fix some other stuff, and then you'll localize into simplified Chinese, and then you'll release it in China. And China was cool with that. They're fine. But over the past decade or so, some countries like China and a few others are starting to push back on that. They say, we don't want a special version for us. We know you have a different version that has different truth in it other than what we believe. We don't want to see that anymore. So basically, the version you're releasing to the world needs to be the version that we receive as well. So they're trying to basically inflict their worldview onto this broader version that goes around the world. Now, arguably, you could say, well, a lot of the versions that go into countries now that are localized actually holds more of a Western viewpoint. And it tends to be true. So they're kind of pushing back that we don't need to see this Western default anymore. We want to see our default instead. And that's really challenging. So there's this aggressive assault on what worldview is allowed as the global default version. And this is making it really tough for a lot of companies. Again, China has been pushing this very hard over the last 5 years or so, where, like, for example, for companies like hotels and airlines, where the airlines originally, if you had select a destination where you want to fly, they would have Tibet and Taiwan shown separately as China. So like under China, you would see Shanghai, Beijing, etc. Well, now China said you have to put Tibet and Taiwan under China. And if you don't, we're going to basically close down your berths at our airports. So what do you think happened? Within 24 hours, all the airlines said, you're done. Yeah, we did it. Look, we fixed it for you. They didn't like an exhibit that was going to be displayed at the Louvre about Genghis Khan because he's a controversial figure in China and has a relation to the Uyghur people, which is controversial. So they basically put pressure on the French government, economic pressure on the French government to not let this happen, even though it's halfway around the world at another museum. And we see these examples a lot. And it's been increasing pretty significantly. We see things like this as well, where Mass Effect was banned in Singapore. I worked on this game, and because we had a lesbian relationship in the game, I actually met with the ratings board in Singapore, who completely denied. They said it has nothing to do with the LGBTQ issue at all. It's just our rating system was not working yet. Well, then, of course, a few years later, they banned Star Wars for the exact same reason. So it's like, I don't think it's your ratings issue. I think it's another issue. Then this issue here, when China announced a couple years ago that they do not want to see same-sex relationships in video games, for a lot of the clients I work with, they said that is the deal breaker. So we are not going to even try to go into China anymore, which is great because they're saying our values stand above our business goals. And we see this a lot in films as well. I mean, Doctor Strange is a pretty well-known example where they basically they changed the Ancient One, who was an old Chinese man in the comic book, and they made it Tilda Swinton playing this Celtic person instead as the Ancient One. And, they did it specifically for China to make China happy because they don't want to piss them off and they want the film to release in that market. What I find really interesting, though, this has changed things quite a bit. So Top Gun, in the original film, he's wearing this jacket, which was his father's jacket. So you can see the Japan flag and the Taiwan flag on the back of the jacket. So when the very first trailers of Top Gun Maverick came out, people saw this jacket. Like, what happened here? Well, obviously they changed it in order to release the movie in China. They took out the Japan flag and the Taiwan flag because China's government doesn't want to see those. Well, because the film was delayed release because of COVID, the backlash online was massive. So much, furor from fans saying, "Why are you doing this?" And so, because the film had a year and a half before its release because of COVID, they actually responded to the fan request, and they went in and they actually changed it. And so in Taiwan, when the film premiered, they said people were cheering and erupting because they're like, "Look, our flag is in the movie." They heard us, they listened to us. Now, of course, what happened here is that this one action made Top Gun Maverick not release in China, and it never has, and it never will, and yet it still made about $2 billion. So it's considered a massive success, and this one film is causing a lot of people in both games and film right now to reconsider whether or not they really need to bend over backwards to sell in China. Like, do we really need that market, even though it is the largest gaming and film market in the world? So that key question is, even back to the metaverse, even if we solve technical interoperability, which is often what I hear about in metaverse conversations, is it still a true metaverse if access to and the perception of the space is not universal? And so there are a lot of issues around inclusivity in the metaverse. I know a lot of different people working on some of these, like, of course, the socioeconomic factor, the price of the hardware, having access to the internet, whether or not it's going to be fair across gender, ethnicity, age, etc. Accessibility issues. If you don't have vision, how do you get to participate in the metaverse? Things like that are being worked on. And of course, the linguistic part too. How do we have real-time localization and internationalization? I think that is a place where AI can help us. We already have a lot of great automated translation tools. So I think that's kind of on the forefront. So I know all of these things are being worked on, but this is just part of the problem. So let's talk about cultural interoperability. So my definition is that this is the ability of an information space to accommodate the widest possible spectrum of geopolitical and cultural worldviews without distortion. Those are the two key words, without distortion, because you don't want distortion, because you want them to be in the same space so that people can perceive them. So what I see happening then as we look towards a potential metaverse is there's 3 degrees of cultural interoperability as I see them, what I call fragmented, filtered, and fused. So the fragmented version is essentially where we have distinct information spaces, each created to accommodate a specific worldview. This is effectively a multiverse. It's not a metaverse. This is what we have at this time. There's multiple platforms using diverse approaches. The entry is regulated by local jurisdiction, and it's happening now. And we're actually seeing a divergence of opinions and divergence of spaces where people are doubling down, like, I only want to talk to people who think like me. And we've been seeing that for the last 10 years. We've been seeing it affect politics and everything else. And so it's like, as we think about, well, we're going to have this metaverse where everyone comes together, it's like, it seems like we're doing the exact opposite in our social media spaces and other nascent information spaces. There are some examples that go beyond this. I mean, you could look at things like Fortnite, or you look at things like even Second Life, which has been around forever, which I think have been really well done in terms of allowing the different viewpoints to live together without too much disruption. But the next step is what I call filtered. So if we get past this fragmented stage, which that's going to be a tough one, if we get past it, then we can consider that we're going to have many worldviews in the same space. But the challenge is that users are only going to see in the space what they're allowed to see based on where they are coming from. So we will maybe have a single platform. Maybe it's proprietary. I don't know. I doubt it's going to be Zuckerberg's. Maybe it's going to be an open source standard, but it'll be some kind of platform where everybody can come together. I think there will be global access, but there's going to be a lot of filtering locally. So, for example, you have a user from Taiwan show up, and they've got the Taiwan flag on their chest, on a T-shirt, on their avatar. The people in China will not see that. They're going to see something completely different. So we're really kind of getting into Black Mirror territory here, where you go into the same space, but what people see is going to be completely different based on where they're from. And you can't really see that. I say the timeline to me is like 15 to 20 years from now is where we might have this. And then the next step, which is pretty much going into the far future, is what I call fuse. So this is where we essentially have all worldviews accommodated in the same space. Essentially, this is the vision of the metaverse, the science fiction vision. We'll have a single open source platform, so anybody can go on there. They can build tools for it and all kinds of things. It'll be global and open. And yeah, I'm going to be long dead. I don't see this happening before I'm in the grave. I just don't, because right now, all of the political and cultural forces of this world are essentially where we were about 100 years ago after World War I, in which we saw more divisiveness, rise of populism, rise of fascism, and it was division rather than coming together. We had to go through another war in order to come together, but then, of course, we ended up in the Cold War. So it never ends. But anyway, we have a lot of challenges coming ahead with this. I mean, there's been a lot of opinions about the metaverse, obviously, and about what it represents in terms of the accuracy or the fidelity of the information space. Will there be distortion or not? And I think that's going to be a very big challenge. We have issues with procedural and generative AI, how that's going to be implemented in the space. I'm not saying it's bad. I think they're fantastic tools, but how that's going to influence the use of perception is going to be huge. Large language models and how those are implemented, the need for standards. I mean, there is the Metaverse standards group that was just started a few months ago. So I have a little bit of hope that people are going to come together and start figuring out. And it's, not only interoperability from technology standpoint, but they're talking a little bit, not enough, about the cultural part. I think they need to talk a lot more about it. So what do we do then? What do we do as game developers? Well, I think we have to do, if we're responding to this and we kind of looking over the horizon a little bit, we do what we can actually solve, which is building these compelling worlds and experiences. And we all know, I think, the games are the foundation for what will probably be the metaverse. We're in that space right now, and we can do what we do best: build a great space, build the experience, and build the must-use case, which is what I call a need-fulfilling world. Somewhere that people feel, I have to be there, I want to be there, my friends are there, other people are there, I have a great way of interacting with other people. What that UX and UI looks like, don't ask me. It's going to be a challenge. But basically, if you build a must-use case, like we've already seen with games, where we've had fantastic cross-cultural collaboration and play from many different cultures in the game, because it's focused on a great experience. And that's, again, why I think games are going to really lead this. And also remembering that content always carries culture, whether we intend for it to not. It carries the culture of our company. It carries the culture of us as individuals. And so we have to be really careful about thinking about what is the meaning behind what we're putting in our worlds, and how is it going to be perceived by people, because it's going to really make or break whatever experiences that we're designing to bring people together. And I really think that inclusivity has to be the foundation. It's like we cannot design a metaverse, and frankly, this applies to games today, is we cannot build a world without thinking about how other people from different divergent worldviews can come together and enjoy the same experience. That's really what it's about. So I love this quote from Albert Einstein. I think it works particularly well here, that you can't use an old map to explore no new world. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now, because we really don't know what's over the horizon. But yeah, for me, it's a bit of a cautionary thing, because I have too many colleagues who are just like so drinking the Kool-Aid of the metaverse. And I'm just like, you keep on drinking, but I'm a bit of a skeptic, as you can tell. But I'm also hopeful, because I really want this to happen. I think there's a lot of benefits to it, but it's not going to be easy. So yeah, there I was at CES in my own metaverse. So I think I ran out of time because of our delays, but there you go. Yeah, okay. So we have a couple of questions. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks for the talk. It was really good. You had a lot of examples of Western games being censored going into Eastern markets.
Yes.
Does the reverse happen much, and we're just unaware, or?
Yeah, there are, but a lot of those are not public domain examples, because I've worked on some of those examples where we have Japanese or Chinese RPGs going into the West. But everything I talk about is public domain. There's stuff I wish I could talk about. But I can tell you that some of the stuff I've worked on where, like I've had Chinese clients like Huawei and NetEase and whatnot. And like in the case of NetEase, they were having challenges because there's a mandate from the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, that Chinese culture must be pushed out through the content. And so there are issues like, if you're playing like a racing game on mobile and all of a sudden this pop-up comes up and says, hey, did you know about like the Purple Lotus Festival in May in China? And players are like, why am I seeing this? I can't see the screen. I'm crashing now. And it's kind of very intrusive because like this really forceful, like, hey, you know, you need to know about this, even though it has nothing to do with the game you're playing. And so they've had issues like that. And I've seen a lot of issues coming out of Japan where we had RPGs because just like a lot of people in the West don't understand some of the contextual issues with Eastern content, it works exactly the same way. I've worked in a lot of Japanese RPGs where they're readily using, you know, the Star of David, the crucifix, I mean, all kinds of religious symbols in a way that would be very inappropriate to the West. And we do change those because it's just, I mean, we don't want their RPG to fail or be banned over here, even though the way it happens over here is not usually quite as knee-jerk. You know, like I get a lot of people who ask me, so who bans games in the United States? Walmart, you know, retailers, Amazon. It's not, there is no government body that bans games. It's the retailers who control that decision. That's why adult-only games don't show up on shelves, because a very conservative company like Walmart is not going to put them on the shelves. And so that's basically they're the ones who regulate that. So, but yes, there are examples of that in the other direction. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. I'm curious, based on all the examples that you've given us, what gives you hope that this will be solved in 30 years? Because I think I might be a bigger skeptic.
That's a great question. My hope is that I think we might reach an inflection point, as we have sometimes in history, where people get fed up with the way things are. And I think it might be more of a guerrilla operation, or kind of just a underground kind of thing that emerges, where somebody creates a platform and it just catches on. You know, we've seen that with some internet platforms. You see it with Reddit and things like that, where just like suddenly explodes and becomes like the place to have dialogues. And I think I see that possibly happening here, where somebody just takes the initiative and they come together and maybe they come up with their own public, you know, public sourced platform, and people just start gravitating towards it and becomes a thing, rather than like top down, where you've got Google and Microsoft and Facebook trying to create their own metaverse. I mean, I think those are probably doomed to fail. You know, I think it's probably going to be the ground up stuff, just like it's been in much of social media. It's been kind of that groundswell of somebody just came up with some tool and all of a sudden it just is like wildfire, spreads to everybody. And I believe that the metaverse is probably going to emerge that way. And then the larger companies will say, well, that seems to be the prevailing, you know, platform that people are using, so we're just going to dive in. Similar to what a lot of large game publishers did with indie development. You know, at first they were kind of like keeping their arm's distance, like, well, those, you know, whatever. Well, then they realized that that's where all the innovation in the industry is happening, is in indie games. So we need to have them on our platform. So then they completely change direction, and they open up, you know, their indie game programs at Xbox and Sony and Nintendo, and, you know, welcome them in because they need that content. And so I kind of feel that that's probably going to happen, but 30 years, maybe, I don't know. We'll see. We have a lot of other big problems in the world to deal with than creating a metaverse, but who knows? People, that's the thing, is that as problems increase, people want a distraction or something to get away from. So that might be the way it comes about.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, cool. Thank you very much.